Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Emma Bergmans. I'm the Senior Policy and Advocacy Advisor at Free Press Unlimited, and I'll be moderating this webinar today in which we will present the findings from our online fact-finding mission in September 2024 to Croatia. This online fact-finding mission was led by Article 19 Europe, together with the European Federation of Journalists in partnership with the Croatian Journalists Association. And from the Media Freedom Rapid Response, the other partners also joined, which are Free Press Unlimited, the International Press Institute, OBCT, and the European Centre for Press and Media Freedom. So during today's webinar, we will be presenting the findings from our online fact-finding mission to assess the state of media freedom in Croatia. We will be presenting the results together with a great number of panelists, which I will present to you shortly. But I just wanted to present some of the key findings to you before we dive a little bit more into the situation. During the fact-finding mission, we found that persistent legal and institutional challenges undermine the independence of media outlets, worsen the precarious working conditions of journalists, and hinder progress towards a pluralistic media landscape. I'll just go over some of the key findings that we highlighted in our report, and then we'll dive into all of those issues a bit more. So firstly, we've seen that media law in Croatia requires comprehensive reform to align with European standards, particularly with the European Media Freedom Act. Key areas include ensuring the independence of the public service broadcaster, editorial independence, enhancing transparency in media ownership, and regulating state advertising practices to prevent undue influence. Secondly, we see that in Croatia there is a high incidence of vexatious lawsuits, also called SLAPPs, strategic lawsuits against public participation. This serves as a tool to intimidate and silence investigative journalism, which is a significant concern. We also see that journalists face increasing verbal and physical harassment, smear campaigns, and financial insecurity. This is particularly problematic for women journalists who are vulnerable to gender-specific threats. Thirdly, access to information is severely restricted in Croatia, which is further exacerbated by new legislation that punishes the disclosure of judicial information. Fourth, we've seen that the public broadcaster, HRD, Croatian Radio and Television, has faced criticism for instances of political interference, including the dismissal of journalists who were critical towards the government and the promotion of content favorable to the ruling party. Their credibility is further undermined by its reliance on state funds and by the parliamentary appointment process for its leadership and oversight bodies. Finally, we've seen that the Agency for Electronic Media and its governing body, the Council for Electronic Media, lack independence due to political interference. Today, I welcome a great lineup of speakers who will elaborate more on each of these individual issues. We are joined today, and please excuse me for the pronunciation, which might not be perfect. We are joined today by Andrej Dimitrijevic, a Croatian journalist at Faktograf, by Maxime Popovic, the Senior Law and Policy Officer at Article 19 Europe, by Melissa Skender, a representative from the Croatian Journalists Association, HND, and by Oliver Monikerl, the Head of European Advocacy at the International Press Institute. I want to start today with inviting Andrej to tell us a little bit more about his experience working as a journalist in Croatia and the main safety challenges that he faces. Over to you, Andrej.
First of all, thank you for the invite to this webinar. It's an honor to be here. To tell something about the challenges, well, it could be a long topic, a long brief, but I'll try to be as short as possible. It's challenging, especially working as an investigative journalist. You're always faced with online harassment, with targeting from the right-wing media and extremists, then from the government itself, from the ministers, from the person of interest you are investigating. So it's not easy, and there is the fact that you already mentioned that Criminal Code of Croatia penalizes insult and intentional defamation. So in my personal case, I had to go to court a few times to defend myself from such accusations. Now in March, I have one court. I have one situation where I have to go to the court and defend myself because the guys that were working for a public company and about which I wrote, their contract was terminated, and after that they sued my former employer Telegram HR and also sued me privately. So I have to go to court to defend myself, which I think is really absurd because the things that I wrote are true. But we're in Croatia, where the system is the way it is. It's not easy being a journalist in Croatia. There are a lot of challenges, and I hope that in future the things will be better, but now they aren't really good, especially if you're working for a fact checker like Factograph, in which I'm working, because there are constant threats and people are saying you're working for Soros, you're working for this, for Freemasons, for this and that, and it's non-stop harassment and insults and slurs, and we get a lot of mail that is very insult oriented, and so it's not very easy.
Thank you so much, Andre. We also found during our online fact-finding that Factograph became the target of a coordinated campaign by an opposition parliamentary member. I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about this and how it affected you and your work.
Yes, that was a really horrendous case. I was trying to find out if member of parliament from Domovinski Pokret, now Domino, Steven Nikola Bartulica, who is now in European Parliament, hadn't disclosed information about his vehicle in his property form. So I tried to find out if this car was his. And then I went to take a photo of that car and him entering the car. And afterwards, he said that I harassed him in front of his children. He posted my picture online and practically called for public lynching of me and Factograph. So also he was saying online and in the media that he'll report me to police and to public ombudsman for children. It was really a terrifying situation because I started to get all kinds of messages from people I didn't know telling me, "Are you proud of yourself, arresting children? How dare you? You're not a journalist, you're this, you're that." And Bartulica kept propelling that narrative. So I had to remove my mobile phone number and my address from public registry phone book. I fear for my life. So it was really unpleasant, and the right-wing media, of course, jumped on board, and one of them, Narod HR, published an article in which they were like questioning who am I, saying Andrei Dimitrievich went to LGBTQ pride, he's some kind of weirdo or something like that, going to my private life and saying that I'm being funded to be a censor for someone and etc. etc. So it went on for months, but I'm not the isolated case because such cases are very often in Croatia. Whenever you write something about right-wing organizations or people coming from them.
Thank you, Andre. I just want to quickly note for our attendees that if you do have any questions, please feel free to post them in the Q&A for any of the speakers, and I'll be sure to ask them after they speak or after everyone has spoken. Thank you so much, Andre, on elaborating a little bit on the safety challenges that you face as a journalist. We also found during the mission that there are quite some problematic laws that also affect the safety of journalists. And I wanted to ask you, Maxime, can you elaborate a little bit on the situation of SLAPPs in Croatia and how that's used to intimidate journalists?
Yes, thank you very much for the question, Emma. Indeed, SLAPPs and more broadly defamation-related legislation and law enforcement is one of the key issues for media freedom in Croatia. The report highlights how these strategic lawsuits against public participation have turned into a tool of legal intimidation against journalists and civil activists. We quote statistic from civil society that shows an approximate of 1,300 lawsuits filed against Croatian journalists and media workers between 2016 and 2023. And an estimated 40% of these lawsuits had SLAPP characteristics, right? So almost half of all lawsuits. Generally, Croatia is among leaders of the worst SLAPP statistics in Europe. And the report and our fact-finding mission found out how powerful and wealthy plaintiffs use civil law to intimidate journalists and others with lengthy and costly proceedings. The plaintiffs are often politicians of various tiers of government, but also business people, other people of power and authority, and even judges, which is quite unique, I must say, for SLAPPs. And damages sought in these claims in Croatia are often very high, disproportionate, and are obviously meant to put an impossible burden on the journalist who reported a contested story or fact in the public interest in the first place. And the issues at stake are often reports of corruption, investigative journalism reports, reports of abuse of power and human rights violations. So very much issues that are in the public interest. We also found out during the mission that it is in the smaller communities where the pressure on journalists can be particularly hard, for example, on the communities on the islands in Croatia.
Thanks, Maxime. That's a huge number of cases. We know, of course, that the European Anti-SLAPP Directive was adopted early last year. I was wondering if there have any steps have been taken in Croatia to implement the directive.
So first to say is that at the basis, Croatia's legislation and judicial practice, they lack effective measures against SLAPPs, as we have found out during the fact-finding mission. There is an overall commitment to transpose the EU anti-SLAPP directive that is being voiced, but it must be understood that the directive only sets the minimum standards, and these minimum standards will not be sufficient to respond to the dire situation that we observe in Croatia. I mean, the basic limitation is also that the directive only requires anti-SLAPP measures in cross-border cases. And the reality of the matter in Croatia is that most problematic cases are not cross-border cases. It is domestic cases that are problematic. So if the Croatian government only implements the minimum standards set in the directive, that will definitely not be enough to address the issue of SLAPPs. The government must create more effective responses. So, for example, these must be grounds for early dismissal of cases that exhibit SLAPP characteristics. There must be clear and short deadlines for judges in dealing with cases and dismissing SLAPPs, cases that are SLAPPs. Obviously, also rules on compensation for defendants and penalties for abusive plaintiffs. And more comprehensive guidance on SLAPP characteristics and early dismissal grounds can be found in the Council of Europe's recommendation of SLAPPs, which is quite extensive as to the procedural rules and material rules that governments can use in building more effective responses to SLAPPs.
Thanks a lot, Maxime. And defamation is often used, of course, as the legal basis of these SLAPP lawsuits. What other problematic legislation is there in Croatia that affects the safety of journalists?
Yeah, so first to say is that unfortunately, civil litigation is not the only tool, as you said, used against journalists. First of all, Croatia's legislation also has criminal sanctions, like Andrei already mentioned, for defamation and insult. And we have found out that these are very much used in practice. These are not just that norms, but they are applied against journalists and others. And they create, in conjunction with civil laws and civil lawsuits, they create this horrific practice of double prosecution, when both criminal charges can be pressed on intentional defamation and insult, and a civil lawsuit can be launched. So, for example, one lawsuit against a journalist or against the media outlet, and then criminal charges against the journalist, right? And try to intimidate them in this double prosecution strategy. In the report, we reiterate international human rights standards. For example, we say that insult should never be a crime in the first place, because freedom of expression protects offensive speech, such as ideas or opinions that might shock or disturb or insult subjectively. They must be tolerated, and especially they must be tolerated by politicians and public figures, which is settled human rights law. There indeed might be illegitimate reasons to protect one's reputation, but these protections and restrictions to ensure this protection must always be proportionate, and they should not produce a chilling effect on journalism. And by definition, the existence of criminal defamation laws is a problem, because they create this chilling effect. They are disproportionate. And it is an issue that Croatia maintains criminal provisions on defamation and insult in the first place. Instead, Croatia should decriminalize defamation and insult, and then also reform civil legislation that can only respond to genuine attacks on reputation. And within the ambit of civil law, there should be a shift from cases that would be prioritizing seeking damages, which is, again, another strategy to intimidate journalists with high damages, but instead opt for alternative remedies, such as the possibility to publish a reply, correction, or apology, which are increasingly recommended by international standards as a more effective response to protect reputation. There must be a delicate balancing of interests between protecting media freedom, freedom of expression, healthy public debate, and the need to protect one's reputation where it is genuine. So maybe just to conclude, on the legal side on defamation, Croatia must decriminalize insult and defamation as soon as possible, then conduct a profound anti-SLAPP reform of legislation and enforcement practice. And these efforts must also be accompanied with training for judges and prosecutors so that they are applied effectively in practice. And there must be a wider awareness-raising effort among the key stakeholders.
Thank you so much, Maxime, for this very comprehensive overview. I was wondering, Melissa, could you tell us a little bit more about your take on media freedom in Croatia and the main legislative and other issues that hinder free expression?
Thank you, Emma. Thank you all. Thank you for inviting me. Well, the report is really great overview of the media situation in Croatia. So I will just address some of the issue. Among the first is non-transparent media ownership, because in the company's law, we have these silent owners, and we have a lot of silent owners of Croatian media. This is some legacy of the privatization of the media from 90s, which wasn't like very transparent. So those silent owners are even not obligated to be listed in the beneficial ownership register. So mainly we don't know who owns the media in Croatia. The Croatian Journalists Association suggests that those media that have silent owners could be marked somehow and prevent from getting public funds, but this suggestion is not received well. Also about media ownership, we have like the Croatian Chamber of Economy that monitors the ownership of the print media. And then we have the Council for Electronic Media that are responsible for tracking of the electronic media ownership. I just want to mention that the Croatian Chamber of Economy doesn't update his database of ownership very often. And also we have the Agency for the Market Competition Protection in cases of cross-media ownership. So we have like many addresses that have media owners, but also no one place where we could like see the changes in the media ownership, and it's really hard to get clearly full picture of media ownership in Croatia. This is one thing. The other thing is state advertising, because we have the state-owned companies in Croatia that are amongst the biggest advertisers in Croatia. It's on top 5 list, I think. The important thing to know is that the management boards of these companies are politically appointed. So then the politician decides in which media those state companies will advertise or in which are not. And just for example, I go through the public procurement records, and in the last year, only Croatian Post have like a budget of 1 million euros for 1 year for advertising in the media. We don't know in which media, we just have like this lump amount. Then safety of journalists that Andre also mentioned in his addressing. Well, this high government official, when they make the verbal attacks, that leads to threats against journalists who are the target of these verbal attacks. So we have like some recording from the close meeting of Croatian government, in which the Prime Minister Andrej Plenković called some independent media as axis of evil. Months after that, the National Weekly received the threats that they warning that journalists are followed, national journalists are followed, and that they will be harmed, similar to the fate of its former editor and co-owner, Ivo Pukanić, that was killed in the bomb attack in 2008. Also Novosti Weekly of Serbian minority in Croatia are attacked from the Homeland movement. It's like Domovinski Pokret, which is a coalition partner of the ruling HDZ in Croatia. They accuse them for being enemy of Croatia, and it like leads to the massive number of threats to the Novosti journalists. And the recent one was like a few weeks ago when they received a letter with dangerous substance. They mentioned that it was a dangerous substance, reference to the nerve agent, and they have to call like military to test this substance that was in the letter as the how to say, they linked this with the 25th anniversary of Novosti, and they called the Novosti like Chetnik magazine. Chetnik is, you probably know who are Chetniks, and Novosti are not like Chetniks. This is one of the strongest newsroom in Croatia. Also, we will expose these threats. We will have like how to say, well, in this Voices Festival that will be in Zagreb by the end of this month, we print all these threats, not all of them, but the most like gross ones, and we will expose them to public to see in which what kind of threats are journalists received. We also have like a journalist calling name. It's like in Croatian, it's the novinar. It could be translated to English as journalist. I also find on Twitter that journalist is really the term that exists in the public space, not only in Croatia, but in some other countries. And for the end, freedom of expression that you already mentioned, it's in jeopardy because there is no editorial independence protected in the main Croatian media. The Media Act from 2004, so we have a Media Act that is old, like for 2 decades, it says the same. They formally protect editorial independence with the so-called media status, which are existing but only on paper, and they are not really implemented. Then also we have a pressure from the lawsuit that Maxim already mentioned, those SLAPPs, and also from the advertisers, you know, because some advertisers like threatening that they won't pay the advertisement in the media who are critically reporting about them. And European Freedom Media Act, we are really worried on how this European Media Freedom Act will be implemented in Croatia, because our Ministry of Culture and Media are not moving forward with that. Not just that, but our Ministry of Culture and Media, Nina Obuljen-Koržinek, said that our legislation are already like in order with the Media Freedom Act. They are not aware how much this Media Freedom Act will have the implication to the media landscape. And well, one of the worries is that they will implement this Media Freedom Act as a special law, you know, like a law on implementing the Media Freedom Act, while we think this act should be implemented in the legislation that already existing, like Media Act and so on. So I think that our government appears to underestimate the importance of the Media Freedom Act, and that's pretty much it. According to legislation. Our legislation are good on paper. That could be like conclusion, but it's not implemented well, and the monitoring is also problematic because all those oversight bodies are not independent.
Thanks so much, Melissa. And we'll dive a little bit more into the European Media Freedom Act in a little bit with Oliver. But before we go there, I just wanted to ask you, one of the key findings of the report was also that access to information is quite restricted. Can you tell us a little bit more how this impacts journalists and their work to impart public information?
I will. And I suggest maybe Andrei had the information from the first hand, because he's using this request for information a lot as an investigative journalist. I think this act, Access to Information Act, is like a clear example on how the implementation of the act is depending about the policy on the body who are like here to implement it. Because our first information commissioner supported the journalists requesting the information, and she creating an online address book of public authorities, because we have lots of public authorities who are claiming that they are not obligated by the law. And then you have this address book, and you can say, but you are on the address book of the commissioner, so you are here. This address book also helped NGOs like Gong to create the online platforms that's similar to UK, What Do They Know, where citizens can send requests easily, and those requests were publicly available. So it's also made some kind of pressure to the authorities to deal with them more seriously. But now the new commissioner now requires you to include your address, so your home address, and even the personal identification number when sending the request. And it's really this extra step makes it more difficult and discourages people, including journalists, from asking the information. And then from the beginning, we have some state-owned companies and some institutions like Financial Agency and the Croatian Bank for Reconstruction and Development, who claims that the information is a business secret. So their resistance weakens the act, and I'm afraid, we are afraid, Croatian Journalists Association are afraid that these new amendments will go in this direction to exclude these state-owned companies and some institutions that are not entirely on the budget, but have some commercial service also, and that they won't be obligated to share the information with the public anymore. So now we have the working group who are working on these amendments. We don't know who are in this working group, even they are legally obligated to publish the composition of the working groups, but they are not doing that. What we know is that the journalist community are not invited to participate in this working group. And I don't know, there is the secrecy in Croatia. It's like some kind of tradition, you know, of secrecy in Croatia, and I don't think that these new changes of the Access to Information Act will help to open the government and the public bodies more to the public, to get public to informed about what's really happening in Croatia.
Thanks so much, Melissa. Andre, do you maybe want to add as well from your personal experience?
Well, on paper, you have right to a lot of things, but in practice, it's often very, very hard to get the info because they're always delaying. They are always trying to put it, as Melissa said, like it's a secret document for this and that reasons, or they have to think if they can give you that information, and in fact, they're just buying time. And as Melissa also said, it's very problematic to give your own address and OIB number, identification number, and the biggest problem I have with it's that it's very slow. Unlike media inquiry, you have to wait 15 days, and then they will say, okay, but now we have to think if this information is something that we can share with you, then we will take another 15 days to consider. And of course, you have stories to write and things are happening. And then it just slows you down, and they know it, and they really abuse it. And a lot of times they don't answer anything, so then you have to write another request, and it just goes on, and really sometimes can drag to a few months time until you get the information you want to, or I should say you have a right to get. So it's, as I said, it's all okay on paper, but in reality, in practice, it's really hard.
Thanks a lot, Andre. Just also for us to see indeed what the situation is in reality and not just on paper. Melissa already elaborated a little bit on her concerns when it comes to media ownership, state advertising, and the European Media Freedom Act. Oliver, can I ask you to tell us a bit more about the situation of media pluralism in Croatia and the challenges that you see?
Yes, thanks, Emma, and thanks, Melissa. Yes, you already touched on, I think, the key issues of media ownership and problems with advertising. We can go into a little bit more detail. I think probably the number one issue for media pluralism is always the public media and the relative independence of the public media. And one thing that was clear from almost all the journalists and interlocutors that we spoke with last year is that HRT, look, it's not the propaganda channel that you see in Hungary or that you used to see in Poland, but there are numerous scandals about corruption, about political bias, about censorship, and it is also very clear it is a very comfortable place for politicians from the government to go, and a very uncomfortable place for for politicians from opposition parties to go. And in fact, it seems that some of the private broadcasters are seen as playing much more of the role of the public broadcaster by giving much more equal time to the different political parties and much fairer sort of interview techniques as well. HND, the Journalists Association, conducted a campaign back in, I think, 2021, where they got a lot of journalists to give testimony to examples of the sort of political pressure that they come under, examples of journalists who have lost their jobs, who have been put into different departments, how investigative journalism has been defunded or put onto late night shows, and also other terrible examples of sexual harassment by senior management that got away with this. And as a consequence of some of these campaigns, the president of the association, within the broadcaster, Zofka Hrojo, lost his job as a result of speaking out against censorship. And the situation is severe when that takes place. Now, of course, the takeover of public broadcasters is not something that takes place overnight. There's no one single cause and there's no one single cure, but it is clear that, and we will look at the European Media Freedom Act because they also look at these two specific issues, but the question of the appointment of the director and the question of the appointment of the supervisory boards is a really important process, and how you try to protect it from political interference. And it's clear that the current system, where there is a simple parliamentary majority required to vote in the recommended applicant to be the HRT director, is insufficient, because that allows the government of the day to effectively, vote in their favoured person. And it's the same system also for the board members. So this is something that needs to be reformed to try to improve the transparency over the recruitment process, to try and strengthen the measures against conflicts of interest or against political alliances, so these processes need to take place, and also to make sure that there is a requirement on the Parliament the government to reach out beyond the political parties who make up the government. So, for example, if there wasn't a simple majority required by Parliament to vote through the director, but some form of supermajority, that might be 60% of the Parliament or two-thirds majority of the Parliament. These are the kinds of models that you see in other countries that can help protect the independence of those who are put in place to manage and oversee the public broadcaster. The second key element is, of course, the financing of any public broadcaster. And again, this is touched upon in EMFA, requirement of adequate financing for it to be able to fulfill its mandate. Now, in Croatia, I think you have a mixture of advertising, private advertising, and the license fee, but the license fee has not increased since, I think, it's 2012. So, with inflation, it is very clear that the public broadcaster is being severely underfunded. As a consequence of that, I think at the beginning of 2024, the government made a very large donation to the public broadcaster, partly to clear up its debt. But there is no coincidence that this very large donation took place also at the beginning of the election year in 2024. So these are two key elements which need to be resolved if the public broadcast is to be able to distance itself from political control and political influence. More broadly, in terms of media pluralism, I think you can look at the same question about with the independence of the media regulator. So again, there's a problem with the appointments process and how you sort of disconnect that from political interference. Obviously, there has to be, both in the media regulator and in the public broadcaster, there has to be some link to parliamentary accountability. That's quite normal in a democratic institutions. But the question is, how do you strengthen the independence of those put in place? And these are things that I think the government has to look at, and has to look at with media stakeholders, to find out what mechanism can be introduced to strengthen those processes. And lastly, I mean, Melissa, you touched upon on advertising. I think the biggest problem there is the lack of transparency. There are some figures, there are some very good investigative journalism which has revealed where money has gone, but we only seem to see the tip of the iceberg. So there is an obligation on state companies to, in theory, to provide this sort of information, but under the law, there is no consequences for the state companies that refuse to provide that information. As a consequence, we know very little about which state companies are spending what on which media. We spoke to the publishers about this problem, and they acknowledge that they do receive, not insignificant funds from the government. And there's nothing wrong with that. The question of transparency is really important, but they also say that this is relatively small compared to all of their other sources of income. And we think that probably the biggest problem, the biggest is how the state advertising or public funds affect local media. And again, I'm looking at Melissa, who's nodding there, because it's based on your investigations from HND into the state of funding of local media, and how I think something like 80% of local government funds spent on media are not subject to tender. So there's no information or very little information about how money is spent. One of the rules of EMFA, I know this is probably your follow-up question, but one of the rules of EMFA requires all government bodies to be transparent about how their funding is spent. But that is limited to governments or government municipalities over a population size of 100,000 people. When the government pushes through its EMFA rules or reforms its law, it is absolutely essential that the requirements are put on governments also include governments regardless of the size of the population, because otherwise for the local municipalities, this is where perhaps the issue is most crucial.
Thanks a lot, Oliver. Indeed, that was going to be my follow-up question. How does this all relate to the EMFA, and which reforms do you see as crucial in Croatia?
Yeah, I mean, look, I've already talked about the Article 5, I think it is, of EMFA on public broadcasting. Most of these requirements are about principles, the principle of independent appointment process, the principle of adequate funding. It is very hard to judge legally when law is in line with EMFA law, but we will see in practice. And I think over the coming years, we will see where there are clear evidence of the breach of this, and then journalists, media organisations, or the public can actually start taking the government to court, but first at the national level and then eventually possibly at the European level. I think those principles are the same with the media regulator, but it's absolutely essential that the media regulator, we haven't talked too much about that, is fully independent, because EMFA will strengthen and expand its powers quite significantly if the government follows the EMFA rules. So at the moment, the CEM is responsible just for broadcast media, but in fact, it also should be monitoring the ownership of all media, and that should all be put together in one publicly accessible database. It is probably also likely to be the organisation appointed for monitoring all of the, not just where state advertising is spent, but also developing the criteria for the distribution of state advertising. So that will apply again across all media. So that's really essential. But perhaps its most important new role will be that it will be required to conduct a media pluralism test. So when there is a merger in the media, when there's a change of ownership, at the moment under EU law, there's no requirement for governments to conduct media pluralism tests beyond the competition test. But with EMFA, this changes, and every country has to identify an institution that is responsible for assessing what the impact would be on media pluralism. So the question, again, that Melissa pointed out about the lack of transparency of these silent owners or these beneficial owners will be absolutely crucial. And the role and the powers, therefore, of the regulator are going to expand. And so the question of the independence of that, or of the regulator, are going to become more and more important following. I think August the 8th is a deadline when the government needs to come into line with EMFA. So if they haven't done anything, as you say, then they really ought to be looking much more closely at it.
Thanks a lot, Oliver, for this overview and also for sharing the main priorities with us. I just wanted to open up the floor for any questions that there might be from the attendees of this webinar, and also to see if any of our panelists would like to make any final remarks. All right, I see one hand is up. Maya, I think you can probably chat or put it in the Q&A. I'm not sure if you can speak here as well. Could you type your question, Maya? Oh, yeah, there you are. Yes.
Now you can hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Oh, super. Sorry, I'm on some event here, so I'm just listening. It's very interesting, very important for us in Croatia. I just want to follow what Melissa emphasized and what Oliver said, and I just want to ask a question for all of us, what we can do next. Because we are mentioning a few times EMFA, and we are expecting impact of EMFA in Croatia. For example, you open and we all open a problem with lack of independence of public media service. But I can tell you, and Melissa can also add if she wants something, that there is no any sign of political will. There is no any sign of, sorry.
I think Maya got cut off. She's off from the call, but Oliver, maybe you want to jump in here.
I think she was talking about political will. I mean, there's a lack of political will at the national level. There's also the question about what level of political will there will be at the European level. So again, governments are required to be compliant with them by August the 8th. Now, Croatia isn't the only government that is behind. So I would imagine the Commission will give governments some time to do this. And in practice, the law comes into law from August the 8th. So it's only when there are breaches in that law, because it's a regulation, it's automatically law, in fact. It's only when there are breaches that they will then come up. And the question is, well, how do we do that? I think, well, our role is to not only to advocate and demand as media stakeholders that we are consulted and part of the reform process, but it's also to monitor breaches in EMFA, because from August the 8th, EMFA is in force, and anything that doesn't meet EMFA, we can already start launching, protests, documenting it, potentially going to court, certainly taking the examples to the European Commission, to the European Board of Media Services, which is this network of media regulators, which is there to oversee particularly media pluralism issues. So already we can start doing that from the middle of the summer holidays.
Thanks a lot, Oliver. Maya, I hope that that helped to answer your question. Are there any other questions or remarks by our speakers? All right. Yeah, Oliver.
I mean, because we've got a couple more minutes. I mean, just to add, but we want the political commitment from the EU level. That will only happen if we do the groundwork. It's the obligation's on us to document all this information and take it up to the Brussels level, and to put pressure on the EU institutions, whether that's in the Parliament, on the Commission, or eventually at the Council, which of course takes the big decisions. We can only, that obligation is on us to put the pressure on them. And it's up, if the EU want this to work, they have to show the political commitment to raise this at the national level as well.
I think you immediately answered Maya's question in the Q&A there, Oliver. She asked what we can do to force them to do their job. All right. Melissa, Andre, Maxime, any final comments from you?
I would just like to say that I hope that this government will finally start doing something for media freedom in Croatia, because the situation is really not good. I hope that in future times we will have some optimistic news to say, and not all grim like it is today, and that media landscape in Croatia will be better. But from current standpoint, it doesn't look good, and I think that we will probably have to protest again and write again and put the pressure on the government, because it doesn't seem like they are willing to do something in the interest of media and democracy.
Thank you, Andrei. Maxime?
Yeah, I just wanted maybe to echo some of the things that were already said, in the sense that we are entering this year, the crucial year, where many European regulations or directives are to be transposed in national legislation. So the time is really now. I mean, it's not only on the EMFA side, but on the fight against SLAPPs. I mean, we see this in many other countries, that if you want to make a difference, this is the crucial time to really speed up advocacy, collect information, bring it to the correct pressure points. The directive, again, as I said, it sets only the minimum standards, right? In many countries, I mean, we see it like in Poland, for example, they're really trying to only comply with the minimum, right? But in countries where the situation is a lot more difficult, where SLAPPs, really a systematic issue for journalism and media freedom, you have to go further than these minimum set requirements, and that's where our role and civil society's role more broadly at the domestic level, at the European level, comes at a crucial time, I think, on many of these issues.
Thank you, Maxime. Melissa?
I would just want to update about this anti-SLAPP directive. We also have a working group on anti-SLAPP directive here in Croatia. We also don't know who are the members of this working group. The one thing we know that there are no journalist community in this working group, and there are no NGO community in this work. So the main targets of SLAPPs in Croatia are not included in drafting this proposal, how to involve anti-SLAPP directive in Croatian legislation. And also, as I already mentioned, with the Ministry of Culture and Media, our government believes that we already have the mechanisms that protects journalists from SLAPP and NGOs from SLAPP, which is not true.
Thanks a lot, Melissa, and thank you to all the speakers who've really highlighted the concerns when it comes to media freedom in Croatia. In late spring, the Media Freedom Rapid Response will conduct a follow-up mission, an advocacy mission to Croatia in person, to also follow up on some of these recommendations and key concerns that we have. I just wanted to flag that the full report of the fact-finding mission can now be found on the MFRR website, and will also be presented at the Voices Festival this coming Friday, where you can talk to representatives from the European Federation of Journalists, who can give you a little bit more information about the report and the findings. Well, thank you all so much for joining this webinar, and thank you to the speakers. Wishing you a good day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Thank you, and thanks to Vision for this report, which is really huge stuff for us now. Thanks.